From the JAMA Network, this is the JAMA Medical News Podcast, discussing timely topics in clinical medicine, biomedical sciences, public health, and health policy, featured in the medical news section of JAMA.
Welcome to this news roundup. I'm Jennifer Abbasi, Director of JAMA Medical News. On today's show, we're discussing a new opioid-like product that's being widely sold at vape shops. We'll also learn about the growing real-world evidence with anti-amyloid therapies for Alzheimer disease. And we'll hear about a controversial FDA panel that put the use of SSRIs during pregnancy in the spotlight. Staff writer Samantha Anderer is here to tell us about 7-OH, a substance with opioid-like effects that consumers can purchase legally in stores and online. Sammy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jen.
Tell us about 7-OH and the concerns around its growing availability and use.
Yeah, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is taking steps to warn the public and clinicians about 7-hydroxymetragenine, also known as 7-OH, and to restrict its sales. The compound is a natural component of the kratom leaf and is present in small quantities, but officials have raised concerns about highly concentrated 7-OH products that people can now buy legally in vape shops, gas stations, corner stores, and online. 7-OH binds to and activates opioid receptors, and it produces pain relief, euphoria, and sedation. A psychiatrist and addiction specialist I spoke with said he has observed 7-OH use both among people with chronic pain looking for an alternative to opioids and people seeking the euphoric effects. Like traditional opioids, 7-OH appears to have a high potential for abuse, according to a new FDA report. According to Caitlin Brown, a clinical managing director at America's Poison Centers, overdose and withdrawal symptoms are similar, including agitation, nausea, vomiting, and fast heart rate. In severe cases, patients have presented with central nervous system depression or respiratory depression. Through May 30th of this year, Poison Centers received reports of 53 cases involving 7-OH, about half of which were classified as intentional abuse. 6 of the cases were in children. By the end of July, the number of 7-OH cases reported to Poison Centers had grown to 165. And right now, 7-OH products are much more accessible than opioids or street drugs. For $15 to $30, a person can go into a store and get these products over the counter, often packaged as tablets, gummies, or energy drinks. They typically come in flavors and are marketed with bold colors, which could appeal to youth.
So, Sammy, you mentioned that 7-OH is a component of kratom. So, can you help us understand the difference between the two?
Yeah, so 7-OH is one of the two main psychoactive components in kratom. But again, it's naturally present only in small quantities. The FDA is raising the alarm on an increasing number of products with unnaturally high amounts of 7-OH, which may be advertised as kratom or 7-OH. The producers of these products likely use synthetic chemical steps to convert a more abundant but less potent psychoactive kratom component into 7-OH. The FDA has made it clear that it is only targeting 7-OH at the moment, not kratom.
Okay, so what actions are U.S. health agencies taking on 7-OH?
The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the FDA are both concerned that, with their easy availability and potential for dependence, 7-OH products could represent the next stage in the opioid crisis. The FDA is recommending that the Drug Enforcement Agency schedule 7-OH as a controlled substance, which would restrict its availability. It also released a scientific assessment on the substance, a letter to healthcare professionals, and educational materials for consumers.
Thank you, Sammy. We'll continue following this development. Let's turn now to Alzheimer's disease. Now that anti-amyloid therapies have been available for a couple of years, we're starting to get real-world evidence on them. Lead senior staff writer Rita Rubin is here to share some of what's being learned.
Yeah, Jen, as you said, it's been 2 years since the FDA, for the first time, granted traditional approval of an anti-amyloid therapy for Alzheimer's disease. And a year after the FDA granted traditional approval to that drug, which was lecanemab, it did the same for donanemab, another anti-amyloid antibody. Amyloid beta plaque in the brain is a hallmark of Alzheimer's, and for decades, scientists have thought that removing the plaque would modify the course of the disease. Over the years, many anti-amyloid therapies were found to remove plaque but provide no clinical benefit. But 18-month phase 3 trials found that lecanemab slowed disease progression by 27%, while donanemab slowed it by 22.3%. Lecanemab has been on the market long enough for physicians to begin reporting on how it's going. A whole session at the recent Alzheimer's Association International Conference in Toronto was devoted to presentations about real-world experience with the treatment. One presenter noted that physicians and patients and their families have been very satisfied with lecanemab, although the researcher acknowledged that their satisfaction might in part stem from the effort they put into providing and getting the expensive treatment. Because lecanemab must be administered at an infusion center every 2 weeks for 18 months, at which point maintenance treatment can begin with monthly infusions. And it's not really clear how long that would continue. With donanemab, patients are infused once a month from the start until their amyloid plaque dissolves below a certain point, at which time they stop treatment. Now, in its phase 3 trial, treated patients cleared amyloid from their brains in as little as 12 months. In their clinical trials, the anti-amyloid treatment's most serious adverse event was amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, ARIA for short. ARIA is characterized by swelling or bleeding in the brain. It's mostly asymptomatic, but it can be quite serious and even life-threatening. In a comparison presented at the Alzheimer's meeting, researchers concluded that published data showed lecanemab had a lower rate of ARIA than donanemab. Now, fortunately, no worrisome safety signals have appeared since the anti-amyloid therapies hit the market. But whether they're actually increasing the amount of time a patient has to do the things they love can't really be determined in the real world, because the real world doesn't come with a placebo comparison group.
So, Rita, why do some patients with dementia not qualify for treatment with anti-amyloid therapy?
Good question, Jen. The anti-amyloid therapies aren't for everyone with dementia. Before beginning treatment, physicians must confirm that patients actually have amyloid plaque in their brain, and they usually do that with positron emission tomography. No sense giving an anti-amyloid drug if the patient doesn't have any amyloid to get rid of. Physicians told me that among people who do have, confirmed amyloid plaque, one of the main reasons they can't get treatment is that they sought care too late. The anti-amyloid monoclonal antibodies are approved for people who are amyloid positive and have mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's disease. That's the population in whom the drugs were tested, and it's thought that the drugs aren't effective when the disease has progressed further.
Thank you, Rita. While we're on the topic of dementia, I'll also mention that we recently reported on a new finding that healthy newborns have high levels of a major Alzheimer's disease biomarker, p-tau, in their blood. But interestingly, this protein doesn't aggregate in infants like it does in patients with Alzheimer's disease. Researchers are plumbing these discoveries for potential insights into this form of dementia. Okay, switching gears. Next, we're talking about SSRIs during pregnancy. The U.S. FDA recently held a panel on the safety and benefits of these medications in pregnancy that has received criticism from medical and patient organizations. Associate Managing Editor Kate Schweitzer is here to fill us in on the controversial panel.
Thanks, Jen. As you said, last month, the FDA hosted a panel to discuss the use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, to treat mental health conditions during pregnancy. And although the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or ACOG, currently recommends SSRIs as a first-line pharmacotherapy for perinatal depression and anxiety, most speakers criticized SSRI treatment practices and focused primarily on the drug's risks during that panel. An FDA spokesperson described the panel as part of the agency's mission to promote evidence-based treatment standards. But as a press release from Postpartum Support International noted, many participants lacked a background in perinatal mental health care. Panel participants, independent experts, and ACOG alike all agree that more research should be done to better understand how SSRIs affect pregnant people and their children. But on the other side of that coin is a common refrain. Recent cuts to the NIH have delayed a planned federal working group that was set to study medications, including SSRIs, in pregnant patients. And besides that, researchers historically have had to contend with the ethics of randomized clinical trials involving pregnant participants. So the existing data we have comes primarily from observational studies, which present their own challenges and limitations.
So what do researchers know about SSRI use during pregnancy?
Research suggests that SSRIs are not associated with a significant increase in major birth defects, and they're not linked to autism once you control for underlying maternal mental health conditions. In fact, multiple sources said such conditions are a confounding variable in a lot of research tying antidepressant use to worse child health outcomes. An adverse effect consistently linked to SSRIs is neonatal adaptation syndrome, observed in 20 to 30% of infants exposed to the drugs in utero. Symptoms range from irritability to difficulty with feeding and breathing, though these tend to subside after just a few days and they present no long-term neurodevelopmental consequences. Meanwhile, untreated maternal mental health conditions carry their own concerns. As one expert shared, these risks include suicidal ideation, worsened outcomes from perinatal conditions like gestational diabetes and hypertensive disorders. They can lead to preterm birth, low birth weight, lactation issues, and impaired child cognitive and behavioral development. Untreated depression also increases the odds someone will smoke, drink alcohol, or use other substances that could harm a developing fetus. And according to a review of U.S. mortality data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than 10% of pregnancy-related deaths could be attributed to a mental health condition. And more than 60% of these deaths were by suicide. It's worth noting that deaths linked to mental illness were more likely to be deemed preventable than other pregnancy-related deaths.
So, Kate, which patients benefit from SSRI treatment in pregnancy, according to our reporting?
That really depends on a patient's risks of relapse and their response to prior treatment approaches. According to one meta-analysis, pregnant people with severe or recurrent depression who discontinued antidepressants were more than 2 times as likely to relapse than people who stayed on their medication. However, there was no association when the analysis included people with more mild depression. And now these patients with mild depression often successfully taper off their meds during pregnancy and manage their condition with lifestyle changes and therapy. But as one reproductive mental health specialist pointed out, this isn't binary. Many patients taking SSRIs use non-medication strategies as well. A recurring theme of the panel was that patients receive inadequate counseling before beginning SSRI treatment or before continuing their regimen during pregnancy. But another study found that only half of people with prenatal depression were diagnosed in a clinical setting, and only 14% received any kind of treatment, let alone medication. So many of the panelists supported stronger, more comprehensive warning labels to address perceived gaps in patient education and clinician judgment. Still, the FDA spokesperson declined to state whether the agency was considering label changes or any other regulations to rein in SSRI use in pregnancy, any of which could ultimately affect payers' willingness to cover that treatment. And regardless, critics warn that even without a policy change, the panel's one-sided discussion of SSRI risks may influence patients' health decisions and dissuade those who would benefit from treatment from pursuing it. It's not one size fits all, and as one expert said, there is no risk-free choice when it comes to untreated mental health conditions in pregnancy. Patients and clinicians together should be making those treatment decisions based on individual needs.
Thank you, Kate. All right, if you'd like to learn more, we'll include links to the stories we discussed in the show description. And you can find all of our stories at jamamedicalnews.com. This month, we also looked at health outcomes 20 years after Hurricane Katrina battered New Orleans. We reported on a new U.S. policy barring undocumented immigrants from receiving many health services. We wrote about how COVID variant surveillance is diminishing while the virus continues to evolve. And in another story, we reported on how COVID and flu infections might awaken dormant cancer cells in cancer survivors. We looked into a Harvard program that's helping clinics around the country address heat-related conditions in their patients. And we published a new data brief on misconceptions around high blood pressure. Thanks to Samantha Anderer, Rita Rubin, and Kate Schweitzer for joining me today. I'm Jennifer Abbasi for JAMA Medical News. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow and Daniel Musisi at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening and join us again next time.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.